Welcome back to Grimoire Audiobooks. Today, we continue our journey through the mind-bending and thought-provoking tale of Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality by the brilliant Les Wrong. This captivating fanfiction reimagines the wizarding world through the lens of science, logic, and intellectual discovery, offering a Harry Potter story like no other. In Part 3, covering chapters 11 to 15, Harry delves even deeper into the mysteries of magic and knowledge, challenging the norms of Hogwarts with his insatiable curiosity and razor-sharp intellect. Friendships will be tested, unconventional methods will spark revolutionary ideas, and the boundaries between logic and magic will blur in the most unexpected ways. Les Wrong is celebrated for their mastery in blending science fiction with beloved fantasy worlds. Known for their ability to provoke thought and inspire wonder, Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality stands as a testament to their storytelling prowess, weaving logic and emotion into a tapestry of brilliance. Disclaimer: this fanfiction is a transformative work based on J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series. All original characters, settings, and trademarks belong to their respective owners. This reading is created purely for entertainment, with no copyright infringement intended. So, sit back, relax, and prepare for a magical roller coaster with Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality by Les Wrong at Grimoire Audiobooks. Once this video reaches 50 likes, the next mind-bending installment will arrive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more magical adventures. Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality by Les Wrong. 11. Omake Files 1, 2, 3. Omake Files Number 1. 72 Hours to Victory. AKA, what happens if you change Harry but leave all other characters constant? Dumbledore peered over his desk at young Harry, twinkling in a kindly sort of way. The boy had come to him with a terribly intense look on his childish face. Dumbledore hoped that whatever this matter was, it wasn't too serious. Harry was far too young for his life trials to be starting already. What was it you wished to speak to me about, Harry? Harry James Potter Evans-Veres leaned forward in his chair, smiling grimly. Headmaster, I got a sharp pain in my scar during the sorting feast. Considering how and where I got the scar, it didn't seem like the sort of thing I should just ignore. I thought at first it was because of Professor Snape, but I followed the Baconian experimental method, which is to find the conditions for both the presence and the absence of the phenomenon, and I've determined that my scar hurts if, and only if, I'm facing the back of Professor Quirrell's head, whatever's under his turban. While it could be something more innocuous, I think we should provisionally assume the worst, that it's you-know-who. Wait, don't look so horrified. This is actually a priceless opportunity. Omake Files Number 2. I ain't afraid of Dark Lords. This was the original version of Chapter 9. It was replaced because, while many readers did enjoy it, many other readers had massive allergies to songs and fanfics for reasons that should not much need belaboring. I didn't want to drive readers away before they got to CH10. Lee Jordan is the fellow prankster of Fred and George in canon. Lee Jordan had sounded like a Muggle-born name to me, implying that he would be capable of instructing Fred and George on a tune that Harry would know. This was not as obvious to some readers as it was to your author. Draco went to Slytherin, and Harry breathed a small sigh of relief. It had seemed like a sure thing, but you never did know what tiny event might upset the course of your master plan. They were approaching the PS now, and over at the Gryffindor table, there was a whispered conversation. What if he doesn't like it? He's got no right to not like it. Not after the prank he played on Dash. Neville Longbottom, his name was Dash. He's as fair a fair target now as fair can be. All right, just make sure you don't forget your parts. We've rehearsed it often enough, over the last 3 hours. And Minerva McGonagall, from where she stood at the speaker's podium of the head table, looked down at the next name on her list. Please don't let him be a Gryffindor. Please don't let him be a Gryffindor. Please don't let him be a Gryffindor. She took a deep breath and called, Potter, Harry. There was a sudden silence in the hall as all whispered conversation stopped. A silence broken by a horrible buzzing noise that modulated and changed in hideous mockery of musical melody. Minerva's head jerked around, shocked, and identified the buzzing noise as coming from the Gryffindor direction, where they were standing on top of the table blowing into some kind of tiny devices held against their lips. Her hand started to drop to her wand, to silencio the lot of them, but another sound stopped her. Dumbledore was chuckling. Minerva's eyes went back to Harry Potter, who had only just started to step out of line before he'd stumbled and halted. Then the young boy began to walk again, moving his legs in odd sweeping motions and waving his arms back and forth and snapping his fingers, in synchrony with their music, to the tune of Ghostbusters, as performed on the kazoo by Fred and George Weasley, and sung by Lee Jordan. "There's a Dark Lord near? Got no need to fear. Who you gonna call?" "Harry Potter," shouted Lee Jordan, and the Weasley twins performed a triumphant chorus. "With a killing curse? Well, it could be worse. Who you gonna call?" "Harry Potter." There were a lot more voices shouting at this time. The Weasley horrors went off into an extended wailing, now accompanied by some of the older Muggleborns who had produced their own tiny devices, transfigured out of the school's silverware, no doubt. As their music reached its anticlimax, Harry Potter shouted, "I ain't afraid of Dark Lords." There was cheering then, especially from the Gryffindor table, and more students produced their own anti-musical instruments. The hideous buzzings redoubled in volume and built to another awful crescendo. "I ain't afraid of Dark Lords." Minerva glanced to both sides of the head table, afraid to look but with all too good a notion of what she would see. Trelawney frantically fanning herself, Flitwick looking on with curiosity, Hagrid clapping along to the music, Sprout looking severe, and Quirrell gazing at the boy with sardonic amusement. Directly to her left, Dumbledore humming along, and directly to her right, Snape gripping his empty wine goblet, white-knuckled, so hard that the thick silver was slowly deforming. Dark robes and a mask? Impossible task? Who you gonna call? Harry Potter. Giant fire ape? Old bat in a cape? Who you gonna call? Harry Potter. Minerva's lips set in a white line. She would have words with them about that last verse, if they thought she was powerless because it was the first day of school and Gryffindor had no points to take away. If they didn't care about detentions, then she would find something else. Then, with a sudden gasp of horror, she looked in Snape's direction. Surely, he realized the Potter boy must have no idea who that was talking about. Snape's face had gone beyond rage into a kind of pleasant indifference. A faint smile played about his lips. He was looking in the direction of Harry Potter, not the Gryffindor table, and his hands held the crumpled remains of a former wine goblet. And Harry walked forwards, sweeping his arms and legs through the motions of the Ghostbusters dance, keeping a smile on his face. It was a great setup, had caught him completely by surprise. The least he could do was play along and not ruin it all. Everyone was cheering him. It made him feel all warm inside, and sort of awful at the same time. They were cheering him for a job he'd done when he was 1 year old. A job he hadn't really finished. Somewhere, somehow, the Dark Lord was still alive. Would they have been cheering quite so hard if they knew that? But the Dark Lord's power had been broken once, and Harry would protect them again. If there was in fact a prophecy, and that was what it said. Well, actually, regardless of what any darn prophecy said, all those people believing in him and cheering him, Harry couldn't stand to let that be false. To flash and fade like so many other child prodigies. To be a disappointment. To fail to live up to his reputation as a symbol of the light, never mind how he'd gotten it. He would absolutely, positively, no matter how long it took and even if it killed him, fulfill their expectations. And then go on to exceed those expectations so that people wondered, looking back, that they had once asked so little of him. And he shouted out the lie that he'd invented because it scanned well and the song called for it. "I ain't afraid of Dark Lords. I ain't afraid of Dark Lords." Harry took his last steps toward the Sorting Hat as the music ended. He swept a bow to the Order of Chaos at the Gryffindor table, and then turned and swept another bow to the other side of the hall, and waited for the applause and giggling to die away. Omake Files Number 3. Alternate Endings of Self-Awareness. The offer to tell the whole plot to anyone who guessed what has never happened before spurred a lot of interesting attempts. The first Omake below is taken directly from my personal favorite answer, by Meteoric Shipyards. The second is based on Kazuma's suggestion for what has never happened before. The third on a combination of Yoyant and Dougal 74. The fourth on Wolf 550E's review of Chapter 10. The one that starts with K, and the one just above that, are from Darkheart 81. The others are my own. Anyone who wants to pick up one of my own ideas and run with them, particularly the last one, is welcome to do so. And before I get 100 indignant complaints, yes, I am well aware that the legislative body of the UK is the House of Commons in Parliament. In the back of his mind, he wondered if the Sorting Hat was genuinely conscious in the sense of being aware of its own awareness, and if so, whether it was satisfied with only getting to talk to 11-year-olds once per year. Its song had implied so. Oh, I'm the Sorting Hat, and I'm okay. I sleep all year, and I work one day. When there was once more silence in the room, Harry sat on the stool and carefully placed onto his head the 800-year-old telepathic artifact of forgotten magic. Thinking, just as hard as he could, don't sort me yet. I have questions I need to ask you. Have I ever been obliviated? Did you sort the Dark Lord when he was a child, and can you tell me about his weaknesses? Can you tell me why I got the Brother Wand to the Dark Lords? Is the Dark Lord's ghost bound to my scar, and is that why I get so angry sometimes? Those are the most important questions, but if you've got another moment, can you tell me anything about how to rediscover the lost magics that created you? And the Sorting Hat answered, no. Yes.
No. No.
Yes and no. Next time don't ask double questions. No and out loud. Ravenclaw.
Oh, dear.
This has never happened before.
What?
I'm allergic to your hair shampoo dash. And then the Sorting Hat sneezed, with a mighty ACHOO that echoed around the Great Hall. Well, Dumbledore cried jovially. It seems Harry Potter has been sorted into the new House of Achew. McGonagall, you can serve as the head of House Achew. You'd better hurry up on making arrangements for Achew's curriculum and classes. Tomorrow is the first day. But, stammered McGonagall, her mind in nearly complete disarray. Who will be head of House Gryffindor? It was all she could think of. She had to stop this somehow. Dumbledore put a finger to his cheek, looking thoughtful. Snape. Snape's screech of protest nearly drowned out McGonagall's. Then who will be head of Slytherin? Hagrid.
Don't sort me yet.
I have questions I need to ask you. Have I ever been obliviated? Did you sort the Dark Lord when he was a child, and can you tell me about his weaknesses? Can you tell me why I got the Brother Wand to the Dark Lords? Is the Dark Lord's ghost bound to my scar, and is that why I get so angry sometimes? Those are the most important questions. But if you've got another moment, can you tell me anything about how to rediscover the lost magics that created you? There was a brief pause. Hello? Do I need to repeat the questions? The Sorting Hat screamed, an awful high-pitched sound that echoed through the Great Hall and caused most of the students to clap their hands over their ears. With a desperate yowl, it leapt off Harry Potter's head and bounded across the floor, pushing itself along with its brim, and made it halfway to the head table before it exploded. Slytherin. Seeing the look of horror on Harry Potter's face, Fred Weasley thought faster than he ever had in his life. In a single motion, he whipped out his wand, whispered Silencio, and then Change my voicio, and finally Ventriloquo. Just kidding, said Fred Weasley. Gryffindor.
Oh, dear.
This has never happened before.
What?
Ordinarily, I would refer such questions to the headmaster, who could ask me in turn if he wished. But some of the information you've asked for is not only beyond your own user level, but beyond the headmaster's. How can I raise my user level? I'm afraid I am not allowed to answer that question at your current user level. What options are available at my user level? After that, it didn't take long. Root.
Oh, dear.
This has never happened before.
What?
I've had to tell students before that they were mothers. It would break your heart to know what I saw in their minds. But this is the first time I've ever had to tell someone they were a father.
What?
Draco Malfoy is carrying your baby. Wait, what? To repeat, Draco Malfoy is carrying your baby, but we're only 11. Actually, Draco is secretly 13 years old. BB, but men can't get pregnant. And a girl under those clothes. But we've never had sex, you idiot. She obliviated you after the rape, moron. Harry Potter fainted. His unconscious body fell off the stool with a dull thud. Ravenclaw called out the hat from where it lay on top of his head. That had been even funnier than its first idea. Elf.
Huh?
Harry remembered Draco mentioning a house elf, but what was that exactly? Judging by the appalled looks dawning on the faces around him, it wasn't anything good. Pancakes. Representatives.
Oh, dear.
This has never happened before.
What?
I've never sorted someone who is a reincarnation of Godric Gryffindor and Salazar Slytherin and Naruto. Atreides. Fooled you again. Hufflepuff. Slytherin. Hufflepuff. Pickled strawberries. Koans. At the head table, Dumbledore went on smiling benignly. Small metallic sounds occasionally came from Snape's direction as he idly compacted the twisted remains of what had once been a heavy silver wine goblet, and Minerva McGonagall clenched the podium in a white-knuckled grip, knowing that Harry Potter's contagious chaos had infected the Sorting Hat itself. Scenario after scenario played out through Minerva's head, each worse than the last. The Hat would say that Harry was too evenly balanced between houses to sort, and decide that he belonged to all of them. The Hat would proclaim that Harry's mind was too strange to be sorted. The Hat would demand that Harry be expelled from Hogwarts. The Hat had gone into a coma. The Hat would insist that a whole new House of Doom be created just to accommodate Harry Potter, and Dumbledore would make her do it. Minerva remembered what Harry had told her in that disastrous trip to Diagon Alley about the planning fallacy she thought it had been and how people were usually too optimistic, even when they thought they were being pessimistic. It was the sort of information that preyed on your mind, dwelling in it and spinning off nightmares. But what was the worst that could happen? Well, in the worst-case scenario, the Hat would assign Harry to a whole new house. Dumbledore would insist that she do it, create a whole new house just for him, and she'd have to rearrange all the class schedules on the first day of term. And Dumbledore would remove her as head of House Gryffindor and give her beloved house over to Professor Binns, the history ghost, and she would be assigned as head of Harry's House of Doom, and she would futilely try to give the child orders, deducting point after point without effect, while disaster after disaster was blamed on her. Was that the worst-case scenario? Minerva honestly didn't see how it could be any worse than that. And even in the very worst case, no matter what happened with Harry, it would all be over in 7 years. Minerva felt her knuckles slowly relax their white-knuckled grip on the podium. Harry had been right. There was a kind of comfort in staring directly into the furthest depths of the darkness, knowing that you had confronted your worst fears and were now prepared. The frightened silence was broken by a single word. "Headmaster," called the Sorting Hat. At the head table, Dumbledore rose, his face puzzled. "Yes," he addressed the Hat. "What is it?" "I wasn't talking to you," said the Hat. "I was sorting Harry Potter into the place in Hogwarts where he most belongs, namely the headmaster's office. 12. Impulse control. Turpin, Lisa. Whisper, 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 Harry Potter. Whisper, whisper, Slytherin, whisper, whisper. No, seriously, what the hell, whisper, whisper. Ravenclaw. Harry joined in the applause, greeting the young girl walking shyly towards the Ravenclaw table, her robe's trim now changed to dark blue. Lisa Turpin appeared torn between her impulse to sit down as far away from Harry Potter as possible and her impulse to run over, forcibly insert herself at his side, and start tearing answers out of him. Being at the center of an extraordinary and curious event, and then being sorted into House Ravenclaw, was closely akin to being dipped in barbecue sauce and flung into a pit of starving kittens. "I promised the Sorting Hat not to talk about it," whispered Harry for the umpteenth time. "Yes, really?" "No, I really did promise the Sorting Hat not to talk about it." "Fine, I promised the Sorting Hat not to talk about most of it, and the rest is private just like yours was, so stop asking. You want to know what happened?"
"Fine."
"Here's part of what happened. I told the Hat that Professor McGonagall threatened to set it on fire, and it told me to tell Professor McGonagall that she was an impudent youngster and she should get off its lawn. If you're not going to believe what I say, then why are you even asking? No, I don't know how I defeated the Dark Lord either. You tell me if you figure it out." "Silence," shouted Professor McGonagall at the podium of the head table. "No talking until the sorting ceremony finishes." There was a brief dip in the volume, as everyone waited to see if she was going to make any specific and credible threats, and then the whispers started up again. Then the silver-bearded ancient stood up from his great golden chair, smiling cheerfully. Instant silence. Someone frantically elbowed Harry as he tried to continue a whisper, and Harry cut himself off in mid-sentence. The cheerful-looking old man sat down again. Note to self: do not mess with Dumbledore. Harry was still trying to process everything that had happened during the incident with the Sorting Hat. Not the least of which was what had happened the instant Harry had lifted the hat off his head. In that moment, he'd heard a tiny whisper as though from nowhere, something that sounded oddly like English and a hiss at the same time, something that had said, "Salutations from Slytherin to Slytherin. If you would seek my secrets, speak to my snake." Harry was sorta guessing that wasn't supposed to be part of the official sorting process, and that it was a bit of extra magic set down by Salazar Slytherin during the making of the hat, and that the hat itself didn't know about it, and that it was triggered when the hat said Slytherin, plus or minus some other conditions, and that a Ravenclaw like himself really wasn't supposed to have heard it, and that if he could find some reliable way of swearing Draco to secrecy so he could ask him about it, that would be an excellent time to have some Comed tea handy. Boy, you resolve not to go down the path of a Dark Lord, and the universe starts messing with you the instant the hat comes off your head. Some days it just doesn't pay to fight destiny. Maybe I'll wait until tomorrow to start on my resolution to not be a Dark Lord. Gryffindor. Ron Weasley got a lot of applause, and not just from the Gryffindors. Apparently, the Weasley family was widely liked around here. Harry, after a moment, smiled and started applauding along with the others. Then again, there was no time like today to turn back from the dark side. Stuff destiny and stuff the universe. He'd show that hat. Zabini, Blaze.
Pause.
Slytherin, shouted the hat. Harry applauded Zabini too, ignoring the odd looks he was getting from everyone including Zabini. No other name was called out after that, and Harry realized that Zabini, Blaze, did sound close to the end of the alphabet. Great, so now he'd only applauded Zabini. Oh well. Dumbledore got up again and began heading towards a podium. Apparently, they were about to be treated to a speech, and Harry was struck by the inspiration for a brilliant experimental test. Hermione had said that Dumbledore was the most powerful wizard alive, right? Harry reached into his pouch and whispered, "Common." For the Comed tea to work, it would have to make Dumbledore say something so ridiculous during his speech that even in Harry's state of mental preparedness, he would still choke. Like, all the Hogwarts students had to not wear any clothes for the whole school year, or everyone was going to be transformed into cats. But then if anyone in the world could resist the power of the Comed tea, it would be Dumbledore. So, if this worked, the Comed tea was literally invincible. Harry pulled the ring on the Comed tea under the table, wanting to do this a bit unobtrusively. The can made a quiet hissing noise. A few heads turned to look at him, but soon turned back as, "Welcome. Welcome to a new year at Hogwarts," said Dumbledore, beaming at the students with his arms opened wide, as if nothing could have pleased him more than to see them all there. Harry took a first mouthful of Comed tea and lowered the can again. He would swallow the pop a little at a time and try not to choke no matter what Dumbledore said. "Before we begin our banquet, I would like to say a few words. And here they are. Happy, happy, boom, boom, swamp, swamp, swamp."
Thank you.
Everyone clapped and cheered, and Dumbledore sat down again. Harry sat frozen as pop trickled out of the corners of his mouth. He had, at least, managed to choke quietly. He really shouldn't have done that. Amazing how much more obvious that became 1 second after it was too late. In retrospect, he probably should have noticed something wrong when he was thinking about everyone being turned into cats. Or even before then, remembered his mental note not to mess with Dumbledore, or his newfound resolution to be more considerate of others, or maybe if he'd had one single scrap of common sense. It was hopeless. He was corrupt to the core. Hail the Dark Lord, Harry. You couldn't fight fate. Someone was asking Harry if he was all right. Others were starting to serve themselves food, which had magically appeared on the table, whatever. "I'm all right," Harry said. "Excuse me." Was that a normal speech for the headmaster? You all didn't seem very surprised. "Oh, "Dumbledore's insane, of course," said an older-looking Ravenclaw sitting next to him who had introduced himself with some name Harry didn't even begin to remember. "Lots of fun. Incredibly powerful wizard. But completely bonkers." He paused. "At some later point, I'd also like to ask why green fluid came out of your lips and then disappeared, though I expect you promised the Sorting Hat not to talk about that either." With a great effort, Harry stopped himself from glancing down at the incriminating can of ComEd tea in his hand. After all, the ComEd tea hadn't just arbitrarily materialized a Quibbler headline about him and Draco. Draco had explained it in a way that made it seem like it had all happened, naturally, as if it had altered history to fit. Harry was mentally imagining himself banging his forehead against the table. Wham! Wham! Wham went his head within his mind. Another student lowered her voice to a whisper. "I hear that Dumbledore is secretly a genius mastermind controlling lots of stuff, and he uses the insanity as a cover so that no one will suspect him." "I've heard that too," whispered a third student, and there were furtive nods from around the table. This couldn't help but catch Harry's attention. "I see," whispered Harry, lowering his own voice. "So, everyone knows that Dumbledore is secretly a mastermind." Most of the students nodded. One or two looked suddenly thoughtful, including the older student sitting next to Harry. "Are you sure this is the Ravenclaw table?" Harry managed not to ask out loud. "Brilliant," Harry whispered. "If everyone knows, no one will suspect it's a secret." "Exactly," whispered a student, and then he frowned. "Wait, that doesn't sound quite right. Note to self. The 75th percentile of Hogwarts students, aka Ravenclaw House, is not the world's most exclusive program for gifted children." But at least he'd learned an important fact today. The ComEd tea was omnipotent. And that meant... Harry blinked in surprise as his mind finally made the obvious connection. That meant that as soon as he learned a spell to temporarily alter his own sense of humor, he could make anything happen by making it so that he would only find that one thing surprising enough to do a spit take, and then drinking a can of ComEd tea. Well, that was a short little journey to godhood. Even I expected this to take longer than my first day of school. Come to think of it, he had also completely wrecked Hogwarts within 10 minutes flat of getting sorted. Harry did feel a certain amount of regret about this. Merlin knew what an insane headmaster was going to do to his next 7 years of schooling, but he couldn't help feeling a twinge of pride, too.
Tomorrow.
No later than tomorrow, at the very latest, he was going to stop walking down the path that led to Dark Lord Harry. A prospect which was sounding scarier by the minute. And yet also, somehow, increasingly attractive. Part of his mind was already visualizing the minions' uniforms. "Eat," the older student sitting next to him growled, and jabbed Harry in the ribs.
"Don't think. Eat."
Harry automatically started loading up his plate with whatever was in front of him, blue sausages with tiny glowing bits, whatever. "What were you thinking about?" the sorting dash began to say Padma Patil, one of the other first-year Ravenclaws. "No pestering during mealtimes," chorused at least 3 people. "House rule," added another. "Otherwise we'd all starve around here." Harry was finding himself really hoping that his clever new idea didn't actually work, and that the ComEd tea worked some other way and didn't actually have the omnipotent power to alter reality. It wasn't that he didn't want to be omnipotent. It was that he just couldn't bear the thought of living in a universe that really worked like that. There was something undignified about ascending through the clever use of fizzy drinks. But he was going to test it experimentally. "You know," said the older student next to him in a quite pleasant tone, "we have a system for forcing people like you to eat. Would you like to find out what it is?" Harry gave up and started eating his blue sausage. It was quite good, especially the glowing bits. Dinner passed with surprising rapidity. Harry tried to sample at least a little of all the weird new foods he saw. His curiosity couldn't stand the thought of not knowing how something tasted. Thank goodness, this wasn't a restaurant where you had to order only one thing, and you never found out what all the other things on the menu tasted like. Harry hated that. It was like a torture chamber for anyone with a spark of curiosity. Find out about only one of the mysteries on this list, haha. Then it was time for dessert, which Harry had completely forgotten to leave room for. He gave up after sampling a small bit of treacle tart. Surely all these things would pass around at least once again over the course of the school year. So what was on his to-do list, besides the ordinary school things? To-do 1. Research mind alteration charms so you can test the ComEd T and see whether you actually did figure out a path to omnipotence. Actually, just research every kind of mind magic you can find. Mind is the foundation of our power as humans. Any kind of magic that affects it is the most important sort of magic there is. To-do 2. Actually, this is to-do 1, and the other is to-do 2. Go through the bookshelves of the Hogwarts and Ravenclaw libraries, familiarize yourself with the system, and making sure you've at least read all the book titles. Second pass, read all tables of contents. Coordinate with Hermione, who has a much better memory than you. Find out if there's an interlibrary loan system at Hogwarts and see if the two of you, especially Hermione, can visit those libraries too. If other houses have private libraries, figure out how to access legally or sneak in. Option 3A. Swear Hermione to secrecy and try to start researching from Slytherin to Slytherin. If you would seek my secrets, speak to my snake. Problem. This sounds highly confidential, and it could take quite a while to randomly run across a book containing a hint. To-do 0. Check out what sort of information search and retrieval spells exist, if any. Library magic isn't as ultimately important as mind magic, but it has a much higher priority. Option 3B. Look for a spell to magically bind Draco Malfoy to secrecy, or magically verify the sincerity of Draco's promise to keep a secret, Veritaserum, and then ask him about Slytherin's message. Actually, Harry had a pretty bad feeling about option 3B. Now that Harry thought about it, he didn't feel all that great about option 3A either. Harry's thoughts flashed back to possibly the worst moment of his life to date, those long seconds of blood-freezing horror beneath the hat, when he thought he'd already failed. He'd wished then to fall back just a few minutes in time and change something, anything before it was too late. And then it had turned out to not be too late after all. Wish granted. You couldn't change history, but you could get it right to start with. Do something differently the first time around. This whole business with seeking Slytherin's secrets seemed an awful lot like the sort of thing where years later you would look back and say, and that was where it all started going wrong. And he would wish desperately for the ability to fall back through time and make a different choice. Wish granted.
Now what?
Harry slowly smiled. It was a rather counterintuitive thought, but he could. There was no rule saying he couldn't. He could just pretend he'd never heard that little whisper. Let the universe go on in exactly the same way it would have if that one critical moment had never occurred. 20 years later, that was what he would desperately wish had happened 20 years ago, and 20 years before 20 years later happened to be right now. Altering the distant past was easy. You just had to think of it at the right time. Or this was even more counterintuitive. He could even inform, say, Professor McGonagall instead of Draco or Hermione. And she could get a few good people together and get that little extra spell taken off the hat.
Why, yes.
That sounded like a remarkably good idea once Harry had actually thought of it. So very obvious in retrospect, and yet somehow option 3C and option 3D just hadn't occurred to him. Harry awarded himself +1 point on his anti-Dark Lord Harry program. It had been an awfully cruel prank the hat had played on him, but you couldn't argue with the results on consequentialist grounds. It certainly did give him a better idea of the victim's perspective, though. To-do 4. Apologize to Neville Longbottom. Okay, he was on a roll here. Now he just had to keep it up. In every day, in every way, I'm getting lighter and lighter. People around Harry had also mostly stopped eating at this point, and the dessert serving dishes began to vanish, and the used plates. When all the plates were gone, Dumbledore once again stood up from his seat. Harry couldn't help but feel the urge to drink another ComEd tea. You've got to be kidding, Harry thought at that piece of himself. But the experiment didn't count if it wasn't replicated, did it? And the damage was already done, wasn't it? Didn't he want to see what would happen this time? Wasn't he curious? What if he got a different result? Hey, I bet you're the same part of my brain that pushed through the prank on Neville Longbottom. Maybe? And is it not overwhelmingly obvious that if I do this I shall regret it 1 second after it is too late?
Yeah.
So, Ahem, said Dumbledore from the podium, stroking his long silver beard. Just a few more words now that we are all fed and watered. I have a few start-of-term notices to give you. First years should note that the forest on the grounds is forbidden to all pupils. That is why it is called the Forbidden Forest. If it were permitted, it would be called the Permitted Forest. Straightforward. Note to self: Forbidden Forest is forbidden. I have also been asked by Mr. Filch, the caretaker, to remind you all that no magic should be used between classes in the corridors. Alas, we all know that what should be and what is are two different things. Thank you for keeping this in mind.
Air.
Quidditch trials will be held in the second week of the term. Anyone interested in playing for their house teams should contact Madam Hooch. Anyone interested in reformulating the entire game of Quidditch should contact Harry Potter. Harry inhaled his own saliva and went into a coughing fit just as all eyes turned towards him. How the hell? He hadn't met Dumbledore's eyes at any point, he didn't think. He certainly hadn't been thinking about Quidditch at the time. He hadn't talked to anyone but Ron Weasley, and he didn't think Ron would have told anyone else, or had Ron run off to a professor to complain. How on earth? Additionally, I must tell you that this year, the third-floor corridor on the right-hand side is out of bounds to everyone who does not wish to die a very painful death. It is guarded by an elaborate series of dangerous and potentially lethal traps, and you cannot possibly get past all of them, especially if you are only in your first year. Harry was numb at this point. And finally, I extend my greatest thanks to Quirinus Quirrell for heroically agreeing to undertake the position of defense against the dark arts professor at Hogwarts. Dumbledore's gaze moved searchingly across the students. I hope all students will extend Professor Quirrell that utmost courtesy and tolerance which is due his extraordinary service to you and this school, and that you will not pester us with any niggling complaints about him, unless you want to try doing his job. What was that about? I now yield the floor to our new faculty member, Professor Quirrell, who would like to say a few words. The young, thin, nervous man who Harry had first met in the leaky cauldron slowly made his way up to the podium, glancing fearfully around in all directions. Harry caught a glimpse of the back of his head, and it looked like Professor Quirrell might already be going bald, despite his seeming youth. "Wonder what's wrong with him," whispered the older-looking student sitting next to Harry. Similar hushed comments were being exchanged elsewhere along the table. Professor Quirrell made his way up to the podium and stood there, blinking.
"Ah," he said.
"Ah." Then his courage seemed to fail him utterly, and he stood there in silence, occasionally twitching. "Oh, great," whispered the older student. "Looks like another long year in defense class dash." "Salutations, my young apprentices," Professor Quirrell said in a dry, confident tone. "We all know that Hogwarts tends to suffer a certain misfortune in its selections for this position, and no doubt many of you are already wondering what doom shall befall me this year. I assure you, that doom is not to be my incompetence." He smiled thinly. "Believe it or not, I have long wished to someday try my hand as the professor of defense against the dark arts here at the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The first to teach this class was Salazar Slytherin himself, and as late as the 14th century it was traditional for the greatest fighting wizards of every persuasion to try their hands at teaching here. Past professors of defense have included not just the legendary wandering hero Harold Shea, but also the quote undying unquote Baba Yaga. Yes, I see some of you are still shuddering at the sound of her name, even though she's been dead for 600 years. That must have been an interesting time to attend Hogwarts, don't you think? Harry was swallowing hard, trying to suppress the sudden surge of emotion that had overcome him when Professor Quirrell had begun speaking. The precise tones reminded him very much of a lecturer at Oxford, and it was starting to hit home that Harry wasn't going to see his home, or his mum, or his dad until Christmas. "You are accustomed to the defense position being filled by incompetents, scoundrels, and the unlucky. To anyone with a sense of history, it bears another reputation entirely. Not everyone who teaches here has been the best, but the best have all taught at Hogwarts." In such august company, and after so much time anticipating this day, I would be ashamed to set myself any standard lower than perfection. And so, I do intend that every one of you will always remember this year as the best defense class that you have ever had. What you learn this year will forever serve as your firm foundation in the arts of defense, no matter who your teachers before and after. Professor Quirrell's expression grew serious. "We have a great deal of lost ground to make up, and not much time to cover it. Therefore, I intend to depart from Hogwarts teaching conventions in a number of respects, as well as introducing some optional after-school activities. He paused. If that is not sufficient, perhaps I can find new ways to motivate you. You are my long-awaited students, and you will do your very best in my long-awaited defense class. I would add some sort of dreadful threat, like, otherwise you will suffer horribly, but that would be so cliched, don't you think? I pride myself on being more imaginative than that. Thank you. Then the vigor and confidence seemed to drain away from Professor Quirrell. His mouth gaped open as if he had suddenly found himself facing an unexpected audience, and he turned with a convulsive jerk and shuffled back to his seat, hunched over as if he was about to collapse in on himself and implode. He seems a little odd, whispered Harry. Meh, said the older-looking student. You ain't seen nothin'. Dumbledore resumed the podium. And now, said Dumbledore, before we go to bed, let us sing the school song. Everyone pick their favorite tune and favorite words, and off we go. 13. Asking the wrong questions. As soon as Harry opened his eyes in the Ravenclaw first-year boys' dormitory, on the morning of his first full day at Hogwarts, he knew something was wrong. It was quiet.
Too quiet.
Oh, right. There was a quietus charm on his bed's headboard, controlled by a small slider bar, which was the only reason it was ever possible for anyone to go to sleep in Ravenclaw. Harry sat up and looked around, expecting to see others rising for the day. The dorm, empty. The beds, rumpled and unmade. The sun coming in at a rather high angle. His quieter turned all the way up to maximum, and his mechanical alarm clock was still running, but the alarm was turned off. He'd been allowed to sleep until 9:52 a.m., apparently. Despite his best efforts to synchronize his 26-hour sleep cycle to his arrival at Hogwarts, he hadn't gotten to sleep last night until around 1 a.m. He'd been planning to wake up at 7 a.m. with the other students. He could stand being a little sleep-deprived his first day so long as he got some sort of magical fix before tomorrow. But now he'd missed breakfast. And his very first class at Hogwarts, in herbology, had started 1 hour and 22 minutes ago. The anger was slowly wakening in him. Oh, what a nice little prank. Turn off his alarm. Turn up the quieter. And let Mr. Big Shot Harry Potter miss his first class, and be blamed for being a heavy sleeper. When Harry found out who'd done this. No, this could only have been done with the cooperation of all 12 other boys in the Ravenclaw dorm. All of them would have seen his sleeping form. All of them had let him sleep through breakfast. The anger drained away, replaced by confusion and a horribly wounded feeling. They'd liked him, he'd thought. Last night, he'd thought they liked him.
Why?
As Harry stepped out of the bed, he saw a piece of paper facing out from his headboard. The paper said, "My fellow Ravenclaws. It's been an extra long day. Please let me sleep in and don't worry about my missing breakfast. I haven't forgotten about my first class. Yours, Harry Potter." And Harry stood there, frozen, ice water beginning to trickle through his veins. The paper was in his own handwriting, in his own mechanical pencil. And he didn't remember writing it. And Harry squinted at the piece of paper. And unless he was imagining it, the words, "I haven't forgotten," were written in a different style, as if he was trying to tell himself something. Had he known he was going to be obliviated? Had he stayed up late, committed some sort of crime or covert activity, but he didn't know the obliviate spell? Had someone else what? A thought occurred to Harry. If he had known he was going to be obliviated, still in his pajamas, Harry ran around his bed to his trunk, pressed his thumb against the lock, pulled out his pouch, stuck in his hand and said, "Note to myself." And another piece of paper popped into his hand. Harry took it out, staring at it. It too was in his own handwriting. The note said, "Dear me, please play the game. You can only play the game once in a lifetime. This is an irreplaceable opportunity. Recognition code 927. I am a potato. Yours."
You.
Harry nodded slowly. Recognition code 927. "I am a potato" was indeed the message he had worked out in advance, some years earlier, while watching TV, that only he would know. If he had to identify a duplicate of himself as being really him, or something. Just in case. Be prepared. Harry couldn't trust the message, There might be other spells involved. But it ruled out any simple prank. He had definitely written this, and he definitely didn't remember writing it. Staring at the paper, Harry became aware of ink showing through from the other side. He flipped it over. The reverse side read, "Instructions for the game. You do not know the rules of the game. You do not know the stakes of the game. You do not know the objective of the game. You do not know who controls the game. You do not know how to end the game. You start with 100 points. Begin." Harry stared at the instructions. This side wasn't handwritten. The writing was perfectly regular, hence artificial. It looked as if it had been inscribed by a quotes quill, such as the one he'd bought to take dictation. He had absolutely no clue what was going on. Well, step 1 was to get dressed and eat. Maybe reverse the order of that. His stomach felt rather empty. He'd missed breakfast, of course, but he was prepared for that eventuality, having visualized it in advance. Harry put his hand into his pouch and said snack bars, expecting to get the box of cereal bars he'd bought before departing for Hogwarts. What popped up did not feel like a box of cereal bars. When Harry brought his hand into his field of vision, he saw 2 tiny candy bars, not nearly enough for a meal, attached to a note, and the note was inscribed in the same writing as the game instructions. The note said, "Attempt failed, -1 point. Current points, 99. Physical state, still hungry. Mental state, confused." Glee, Harry's mouth said without any sort of conscious intervention or decision on his part. He stood there for around a minute. 1 minute later, it still didn't make any sense, and he still had absolutely no idea what was going on, and his brain hadn't even begun to grasp at any hypotheses, like his mental hands were encased in rubber balls and couldn't pick anything up. His stomach, which had its own priorities, suggested a possible experimental probe.
Ah.
Harry said to the empty room, "I don't suppose I could spend a point and get my box of cereal bars back." There was only silence. Harry put his hand into the pouch and said box of cereal bars. A box that felt like the right shape popped up into his hand, but it was too light and it was open and it was empty, and the note attached to it said, "Points spent, 1. Current points, 98. You have gained a box of cereal bars." "I'd like to spend 1 point and get the actual cereal bars back," said Harry. Again, silence. Harry put his hand into the pouch and said cereal bars. Nothing came up. Harry shrugged despairingly and went over to the cabinet he'd been given near his bed to get his wizard's robes for the day. On the floor of the cabinet, under his robes, were the cereal bars and a note. "Points spent, 1. Current points, 97. You have gained 6 cereal bars. You are still wearing pajamas. Do not eat while you are wearing your pajamas. You will get a pajama penalty. And now I know that whoever controls the game is insane. My guess is that the game is controlled by Dumbledore," Harry said out loud. Maybe this time he could set a new land speed record for being quick on the uptake. Silence. But Harry was starting to pick up the pattern. The note would be in the next place he looked. So Harry looked under his bed.
Ha.
Ha 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 ha. Ha 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 ha.
Ha. Ha. Ha. Ha. Ha. Ha.
Dumbledore does not control the game. Bad guess. Very bad guess. -20 points. And you are still wearing pajamas. It is your 4th move. And you are still wearing pajamas. Pajama penalty. -2 points. Current points. 75. Welp, that was a puzzler, all right. It was only his first day at school, and once you ruled out Dumbledore, he didn't know the name of anyone else here who was this crazy. His body more or less on autopilot, Harry gathered up a set of robes and underwear, pulled out the cavern level of his trunk. He was a very private sort of person, and someone might walk into the dorm, got dressed, and then went back upstairs to put away his pajamas. Harry paused before pulling out the cabinet drawer that held his pajamas. If the pattern here held true, how can I earn more points? Harry said out loud. Then he pulled out the drawer. Opportunities to do good are everywhere. But darkness is where the light needs to be. Cost of question, 1 point. Current points, 74. Nice underwear. Did your mother pick them out? Harry crushed the note in his hand, face flaming scarlet. Draco's curse came back to him. Son of a mudblood. At this point, he knew better than to say it out loud. He would probably get a profanity penalty. Harry girded himself with his moleskin pouch and wand. He peeled off the wrapper of one of his cereal bars and threw it into the room's rubbish bin, where it landed atop a mostly uneaten chocolate frog, a crumpled envelope, and some green and red wrapping paper. He put the other cereal bars into his moleskin pouch. He looked around in a final, desperate, and ultimately futile search for clues. And then Harry left the dorm, eating as he went, in search of the Slytherin dungeons. At least that was what he thought the line was about. Trying to navigate the halls of Hogwarts was probably not quite as bad as wandering around inside an Escher painting. That was the sort of thing you said for rhetorical effect rather than for its being true. A short time later, Harry was thinking that in fact an Escher painting would have both pluses and minuses compared to Hogwarts. Minuses: no consistent gravitational orientation. Pluses: at least the stairs wouldn't move around while you were still on them. Harry had originally climbed 4 flights of stairs to get to his dorm. After clambering down no fewer than 12 flights of stairs without getting anywhere near the dungeons, Harry had concluded that 1. An Escher painting would be a cakewalk by comparison, 2. He was somehow higher in the castle than when he'd started, and 3. He was so thoroughly lost that he wouldn't have been surprised to look out of the next window and see 2 moons in the sky. Backup plan A had been to stop and ask for directions, but there seemed to be an extreme lack of people wandering around, as if the beggars were all attending class the way they were supposed to or something. Backup plan B. I'm lost, Harry said out loud. Can, the spirit of the Hogwarts castle help me or something? I don't think this castle has a spirit, observed a wizened old lady in one of the paintings on the walls. Life, perhaps, but not spirit. There was a brief pause. Are you Dash? Harry said, and then shut his mouth. On second thought, no, he was not going to ask the painting whether it was fully conscious in the sense of being aware of its own awareness. I'm Harry Potter, said his mouth, more or less on autopilot. Also more or less automatically, Harry stuck out a hand towards the painting. The woman in the painting looked down at Harry's hand and raised her eyebrows. Slowly, the hand dropped back to Harry's side. Sorry, Harry said. I'm sort of new here. So I perceive, young Raven. Where are you trying to go? Harry hesitated.
I'm not really sure, he said.
Then perhaps you are already there. Well, wherever I am trying to go, I don't think this is it. Harry shut his mouth, aware of just how much he was sounding like an idiot. Let me start over. I'm playing this game, only I don't know what the rules are, Dash. That didn't really work either, did it? Okay, third try. I'm looking for opportunities to do good so I can score points, and all I have is this cryptic hint about how darkness is where the light needs to be, so I was trying to go down, but I seem to keep going up instead. The old lady in the painting was looking at him rather skeptically. Harry sighed. My life tends to get a bit peculiar. Would it be fair to say that you don't know where you're going or why you're trying to get there? Entirely fair. The old lady nodded. I'm not sure that being lost is your most important problem, young man. True, but unlike the more important problems, it's a problem I can understand how to solve, and wow, is this conversation turning into a metaphor for human existence? I didn't even realize that was happening until just now. The lady eyed Harry appraisingly. You are a fine young Raven, aren't you? For a moment, I was starting to wonder. Well then, as a general rule, if you keep on turning left, you're bound to keep going down. That sounded strangely familiar, but Harry couldn't recall where he'd heard it before. You seem like a very intelligent person. Or a picture of a very intelligent person. Anyway, have you heard of a mysterious game where you can only play once, and they won't tell you the rules? Life, said the lady at once. That's one of the most obvious riddles I've ever heard. Harry blinked. No, he said slowly. I mean, I got an actual note and everything saying that I had to play the game, but I wouldn't be told the rules, and someone is leaving me little slips of paper telling me how many points I've lost for violating the rules, like a -2-point penalty for wearing pajamas. Do you know anyone here at Hogwarts who's crazy enough and powerful enough to do something like that? Besides Dumbledore, I mean. The picture of a lady sighed. I'm only a picture, young man. I remember Hogwarts as it was, not Hogwarts as it is. All I can tell you is that if this were a riddle, the answer would be that the game is life, and that while we do not make all the rules ourselves, the one who awards or takes points is always you. If it is not riddle but reality, then I do not know. Harry bowed very low to the picture. Thank you, milady. The lady curtsied to him. I wish I could say that I'll remember you with fondness, she said, but I probably won't remember you at all. Farewell, Harry Potter. He bowed again in reply and started to climb down the nearest flight of stairs. 4 left turns later, he found himself staring down a corridor that ended, abruptly, in a tumbled mound of large rocks, as if there had been a cave-in. Only the surrounding walls and ceiling were intact and made of quite regular castle stones. All right, Harry said to the empty air. I give up. I'm asking for another hint. How do I get to where I need to go? A hint. A hint, you say? The excited voice came from a painting on the wall not far away, this one a portrait of a middle-aged man in the loudest pink robes that Harry had ever seen or even imagined. In the portrait, he was wearing a droopy old pointed hat with a fish on it, not a drawing of a fish, mind, but a fish. Yes, Harry said. A hint, I say. Only not just any hint. I'm looking for a specific hint. It's for a game I'm playing dash. Yes. A hint for the game. You're Harry Potter, aren't you? I'm Cornelian Flubberwalt. I was told by Aaron the consort, who was told by Lord Weaselnose, who was told by, I forget really. But it was a message for me to give to you. For me. No one's cared about me in, I don't know how long. Maybe ever. I've been stuck down here in this bloody useless old corridor. A hint. I have your hint. It will only cost you 3 points. Do you want it? Yes. I want it. Harry was aware that he probably ought to keep his sarcasm under control, but he just couldn't seem to help himself. The darkness can be found between the green study rooms and McGonagall's Transfiguration class. That's the hint. And get a move on. You're slower than a sack of snails. Minus 10 points for being slow. Now you have 61 points. That was the rest of the message. Thank you, Harry said. He was really getting behind on the game here. I don't suppose you know where the message originally came from, do you? It was spoken by a hollow voice that bellowed forth from a gap within the air itself, a gap that opened upon a fiery abyss. That's what they told me. Harry was no longer sure at this point whether this was the sort of thing he ought to be skeptical about, or the sort of thing he should just take in stride. And how can I find the line between the green study rooms and Transfiguration class? Just spin back around and go left, right, down, right, left, right, up, and left again. You'll be at the green study room, and if you go in and walk straight out the opposite side, you'll be on a big curvy corridor that goes to an intersection, and on the right side of that intersection will be a long straight hallway that goes to the Transfiguration classroom. The figure of the middle-aged man paused. At least that's how it was when I was in Hogwarts. This is a Monday on an odd-numbered year, isn't it? Pencil and mechanical paper, Harry said to his pouch. Cancel that. Paper and mechanical pencil. He looked up. Could you repeat that? After getting lost another 2 times, Harry felt that he was beginning to understand the basic rule for navigating the ever-changing maze that was Hogwarts, namely, ask a painting for directions. If this reflected some sort of incredibly deep life lesson, he couldn't figure out what it was. The green study room was a surprisingly pleasant space with sunlight streaming in from windows of green-stained glass that showed dragons in calm, pastoral scenes. It had chairs that looked extremely comfortable and tables that seemed very well suited to studying in the company of 1 to 3 friends. Harry couldn't actually walk straight through and out the door on the other side. There were bookshelves set into the wall, and he had to go over and read some of the titles, so as to not lose his claim to the Verres family name. But he did it quickly, mindful of the complaint about being slow, and then went out the other side. He was walking down the big curvy corridor when he heard a young boy's voice cry out. At times like this, Harry had an excuse to sprint all out with no regards for saving energy or doing proper warm-up exercises or worrying about crashing into things, a sudden frantic flight that nearly came to an equally sudden halt as he almost ran over a group of 6 first-year Hufflepuffs, who were huddled together, looking rather scared and like they desperately wanted to do something but couldn't figure out what, which probably had something to do with the group of 5 older Slytherins who seemed to be surrounding another young boy. Harry was suddenly rather angry. "Excuse me," shouted Harry at the top of his lungs. It might not have been necessary. People were already looking at him. But it certainly served to stop all the action cold. Harry walked past the cluster of Hufflepuffs towards the Slytherins. They looked down at him with expressions that ranged from anger to amusement to delight. Part of Harry's brain was screaming in panic that these were much older and bigger boys who could stomp him flat. Another part said dryly that anyone caught seriously stomping the boy who lived was in for a whole world of trouble, especially if they were a pack of older Slytherins and there were 7 Hufflepuffs who saw it, and that the chance of them doing him any permanent damage in the presence of witnesses was nearly zero. The only real weapon the older boys had against him was his own fear, if he allowed that. Then Harry saw that the boy they had trapped was Neville Longbottom. Of course. That settled it. Harry had decided to apologize humbly to Neville, and that meant Neville was his. How dare they? Harry reached out and grabbed Neville by the wrist and yanked him out from between the Slytherins, the boy stumbling in shock as Harry pulled him out and in nearly the same motion pushed his own way through the same gap. And Harry stood in the center of the Slytherins where Neville had stood, looking up at the much older, larger, and stronger boys. "Hello," Harry said. "I'm the boy who lived." There was a rather awkward pause. No one seemed to know where the conversation was supposed to go from there. Harry's eyes dropped downwards and saw some books and papers scattered around the floor. Oh, the old game where you let the boy try to pick up his books and then knock them out of his hand again. Harry couldn't remember ever being the object of that game himself, but he had a good imagination, and his imagination was making him furious. Well, once the larger situation was resolved, it would be easy enough for Neville to come back and pick up his materials, provided that the Slytherins stayed too intent on him to think of doing anything to the books. Unfortunately, his straying eyes had been noted. "Ooh," said the largest of the boys. "Did Oa want the whittled books, Dash?" "Shut up," Harry said coldly. "Keep them off balance. Don't do what they expect. Don't fall into a pattern that calls for them to bully you. Is this part of some incredibly clever plan that will gain you future advantage, or is it as pointless a disgrace to the name of Salazar Slytherin as a Dash?" The largest boy shoved Harry Potter hard, and he went sprawling out of the circle of Slytherins onto the hard stone floor of Hogwarts. And the Slytherins laughed. Harry rose up in what seemed to him like terribly slow motion. He didn't know yet how to use his wand, but there was no reason to let that stop him, under the circumstances. "I'd like to pay as many points as it takes to get rid of this person," Harry said, pointing with his finger to the largest Slytherin. Then Harry lifted his other hand, said abracadabra, and snapped his fingers. At the word abracadabra, 2 of the Hufflepuffs screamed, including Neville. 3 other Slytherins leapt desperately out of the way of Harry's finger, and the largest Slytherin staggered back with an expression of shock, a sudden splash of red decorating his face and neck and chest. Harry had not been expecting that. Slowly, the largest Slytherin reached up to his head and peeled off the pan of cherry pie that had just draped itself over him. The largest Slytherin held the pan in his hand for a moment, staring at it, then dropped it to the floor. It probably wasn't the best time in the world for one of the Hufflepuffs to start laughing, but that was exactly what one of the Hufflepuffs was doing. Then Harry caught sight of the note on the bottom of the pan. "Hold on," Harry said, and darted forward to pick up the note. "This note's for me, I think, Dash." "You," growled the largest Slytherin, "you are going to Dash?" "Look at this," shouted Harry, brandishing the note at the older Slytherin. "I mean, just look at this. Can you believe I'm being charged 30 points for shipping and handling on one lousy pie? 30 points. I'm turning a loss on the deal even after rescuing an innocent boy in distress. And storage fees? Conveyance charges? Drayage costs? How do you get drayage costs on a pie?" There was another one of those awkward pauses. Harry thought deadly thoughts at whichever Hufflepuff couldn't seem to stop giggling. That idiot was going to get him hurt. Harry stepped back and shot the Slytherins his best lethal glare. "Now go away, or I will just keep making your existence more and more surreal until you do. Let me warn you, messing with my life tends to make your life a little hairy. Get it?" In a single terrible motion, the largest Slytherin whipped his wand out to point at Harry, and in the same instant was hit on the other side of his head by another pie, this one bright blueberry. The note on this pie was rather large and clearly readable. You might want to read the note on that pie, Harry observed. I think it's for you this time. The Slytherin slowly reached up, took the pie pan, turned it over with a wet glop that dropped more blueberry on the floor, and read a note that said, "Warning! No magic may be used on the contestant while the game is in progress. Further interference in the game will be reported to the game authorities." The expression of sheer bafflement on the Slytherin's face was a look of art. Harry thought that he might be starting to like this game controller. "Look," Harry said, "you want to call it a day? I think things are spiraling out of control here. How about you go back to Slytherin and I go back to Ravenclaw, and we all just cool down a bit, okay?" "I've got a better idea," hissed the largest Slytherin. "How about if you accidentally break all your fingers? How in Merlin's name do you stage a believable accident after making the threat in front of a dozen witnesses? You idiot dash." The largest Slytherin slowly, deliberately reached out towards Harry's hands, and Harry froze in place, the part of his brain that was noticing the other boy's age and strength finally managing to make itself heard, screaming, "What the heck am I doing?" "Wait," said one of the other Slytherins, his voice suddenly panicky. "Stop, you shouldn't actually do that." The largest Slytherin ignored him, taking Harry's right hand firmly in his left hand, and taking Harry's index finger in his right hand. Harry stared the Slytherin straight in the eyes. Part of Harry was screaming, this wasn't supposed to happen, this wasn't allowed to happen, grown-ups would never let something like this actually happen. Slowly, the Slytherin started to bend his index finger backwards. "He hasn't actually broken my finger, and it is beneath me to so much as flinch until he does. Until then, this is just another attempt to cause fear." "Stop," said the Slytherin who had objected before. "Stop, this is a very bad idea." "I rather agree," said an icy voice. An older woman's voice. The largest Slytherin let go of Harry's hand and jumped backwards as if burned. "Professor Sprout," cried one of the Hufflepuffs, sounding as glad as anyone Harry had ever heard in his life. Into Harry's field of vision, as he turned, stalked a dumpy little woman with messily curled gray hair and clothes covered with dirt. She pointed an accusing finger at the Slytherins. "Explain yourselves," she said. "What are you doing with my Hufflepuffs and—" She looked at him. "My fine student, Harry Potter." Oh. That's right, it was her class I missed this morning." "He threatened to kill us," blurted one of the other Slytherins, the same one who'd called for a halt. "What?" Harry said blankly. "I did not. If I was going to kill you, I wouldn't make public threats first." A third Slytherin laughed helplessly and then stopped abruptly as the other boys shot him deadly glares. Professor Sprout had adopted a rather skeptical expression. "What death threat would this be, exactly?" "The killing curse." "He pretended to use the killing curse on us." Professor Sprout turned to look at Harry. "Yes, quite a terrible threat from an 11-year-old boy. Though still not something you should ever dream of pretending, Harry Potter." "I don't even know the words to the killing curse," Harry said promptly. "And I didn't have my wand out at any time." Now Professor Sprout was giving Harry a skeptical look. "I suppose this boy hit himself with 2 pies, then." "He didn't use his wand," blurted one of the young Hufflepuffs. "I don't know how he did it either. He just snapped his fingers, and there was pie." "Really?" said Professor Sprout after a pause. "She drew her own wand. I won't require it, since you do seem to be the victim here, but would you mind if I checked your wand to verify that?" Harry took out his wand. "What do I dash?" "Prior Incantato," said Sprout. She frowned. "That's odd. Your wand doesn't seem to have been used at all." Harry shrugged. "It hasn't actually. I only got my wand in schoolbooks a few days ago." Sprout nodded. "Then we have a clear case of accidental magic from a boy who felt threatened. And the rules plainly state that you are not to be held responsible. As for you—" She turned to the Slytherins. Her eyes dropped deliberately to Neville's books, lying on the floor. There was a long silence during which she looked at the 5 Slytherins. 3 points from Slytherin each," she said finally. "And 6 from him," pointing to the boy covered in pie. "Don't you ever meddle with my Hufflepuffs again, or my student Harry Potter either. Now go." She didn't have to repeat herself. The Slytherins turned and walked away very quickly. Neville went and started picking up his books. He seemed to be crying, but only a little. It might have been from delayed shock, or it might have been because the other boys were helping him. "Thank you very much, Harry Potter," Professor Sprout said to him. 7 points to Ravenclaw, 1 for each Hufflepuff you helped protect. And I won't say anything more. Harry blinked. He'd been expecting something more along the lines of a lecture about keeping himself out of trouble and a rather severe scolding for missing his very first class. Maybe he should have gone to Hufflepuff. Sprout was cool. "Scourgify," Sprout said to the mess of pie on the floor, which promptly vanished. And she left, walking along the hall that led to the green study room. "How did you do that?" hissed one of the Hufflepuff boys as soon as she was gone. Harry smiled smugly. "I can make anything I want happen just by snapping my fingers." The boy's eyes widened. "Really?"
"No," said Harry.
"But when you're telling everyone this story, be sure to share it with Hermione Granger in first-year Ravenclaw. She has an anecdote you might find amusing." He had absolutely no clue what was happening, but he wasn't about to pass up the opportunity to add to his growing legend. "Oh, and what was all that about the killing curse?" The boy gave him a strange look. "You really don't know?" "If I did, I wouldn't be asking." "The words to the killing curse are..." The boy swallowed, and his voice dropped to a whisper, and he held his hands away from his sides as if to make it very clear that he wasn't holding a wand. "Avada Kedavra." "Well, of course they are." Harry put this on his growing list of things to never ever tell his dad, Professor Michael Vers-Evans. It was bad enough talking about how you were the only person to survive the fearsome killing curse, without having to admit that the killing curse was abracadabra. "I see," Harry said after a pause. "Well, that's the last time I ever say that before snapping my fingers, though it had produced an effect that might be tactically useful." "Why did you dash?" "Raised by Muggles. Muggles think it's a joke and that it's funny. Seriously, that's what happened." "Sorry, but can you remind me of your name?" "I'm Ernie Macmillan," said the Hufflepuff. He held out his hand, and Harry shook it. "Honored to meet you." Harry executed a slight bow. "Pleased to meet you." Skip the honored thing. Then the other boys crowded round him, and there was a sudden flood of introductions. When they were done, Harry swallowed. This was going to be very difficult. If everyone would excuse me, I have something to say to Neville Dash." All eyes turned to Neville, who took a step back, his face looking apprehensive. "I suppose," Neville said in a tiny voice, "you're going to say I should have been braver, Dash." "Oh, no, nothing like that," Harry said hastily. "Nothing to do with that. It's just, something the Sorting Hat told me, Dash." Suddenly the other boys looked very interested, except for Neville, who was looking even more apprehensive. There seemed to be something blocking Harry's throat. He knew he should just blurt it out, and it was like he'd swallowed a large brick that was just stuck in the way. It was like Harry had to manually take control of his lips and produce each syllable individually, but he managed to make it happen. "I'm sore, RY." He exhaled and took a deep breath. "For what I did, the other day. You don't have to be gracious about it or anything. I'll understand if you just hate me. This isn't about me trying to look cool by apologizing or you're having to accept it. What I did was wrong." There was a pause. Neville clutched his books tighter to his chest. "Why did you do it?" he said in a thin, wavering voice. He blinked, as if trying to hold back tears. "Why does everyone do that to me? Even the boy who lived." Harry suddenly felt smaller than he ever had in his life. "I'm sorry," Harry said again, his voice now hoarse-ned. "It's just, you looked so scared. It was like a sign over your head saying, 'Victim,' and I wanted to show you that things don't always turn out badly. That sometimes the monsters give you chocolate. I thought if I showed you that, you might realize there wasn't so much to be afraid of, Dash." "But there is," whispered Neville. "You saw it today, there is." They wouldn't have done anything really bad in front of witnesses. Their main weapon is fear. That's why they target you, because they can see you're afraid. I wanted to make you less afraid, show you that the fear was worse than the thing itself, or that was what I told myself. But the Sorting Hat told me that I was lying to myself, and that I really did it because it was fun. So that's why I'm apologizing, Dash." "You hurt me," said Neville. "Just now. When you grabbed me and pulled me away from them." Neville held out his arm and pointed to where Harry had grabbed him. I might have a bruise here later from how hard you pulled. You hurt me worse than anything the Slytherins did by bumping into me, actually. Neville, hissed Ernie. He was trying to save you. I'm sorry, whispered Harry. When I saw that I just got really angry. Neville looked at him steadily. So you yanked me out really hard and put yourself in where I was and went, hello, I'm the boy who lived. Harry nodded. I think you're going to be really cool someday, Neville said. But right now you're not. Harry swallowed the sudden knot in his throat and walked away. He continued down the corridor to the intersection, then turned left into a hallway and kept on walking, blindly. What was he supposed to do here? Never get angry? He wasn't sure he could have done anything without being angry, and who knows what would have happened to Neville and his books then. Besides, Harry had read enough fantasy books to know how this one went. He would try to suppress the anger and he would fail, and it would keep coming out again. And after this whole long journey of self-discovery, he would learn at the end that his anger was a part of himself, and that only by accepting it could he learn to use it wisely. Star Wars was the only universe in which the answer actually was that you were supposed to cut yourself off completely from negative emotions, and something about Yoda had always made Harry hate the little green moron. So the obvious time-saving plan was to skip the journey of self-discovery and go straight to the part where he realized that only by accepting his anger as a part of himself could he stay in control of it. The problem was that he didn't feel out of control when he was angry. The cold rage made him feel like he was in control. It was only when he looked back that events as a whole seemed to have blown up out of control, somehow. He wondered how much the game controller cared about that sort of thing, and whether he'd won or lost points for it. Harry himself felt like he'd lost quite a few points, and he was sure the old lady in the picture would have told him that his was the only opinion that mattered. And Harry was also wondering whether the game controller had sent Professor Sprout. It was the logical thought. The note had threatened to notify the game authorities, and then their Professor Sprout was. Maybe Professor Sprout was the game controller. The head of House Hufflepuff would be the last person anyone would suspect, which ought to put her near the top of Harry's list. He'd read 1 or 2 mystery novels, too. So, how am I doing in the game? Harry said out loud. A sheet of paper flew over his head, as if someone had thrown it from behind him. Harry turned around, but there was no one there, and when Harry turned forwards again, the note was settling to the floor. The note said, Points for style, 10. Points for good thinking, -3 million. Ravenclaw house points bonus, 70. Current points, -2,999,871. Turns remaining, 2. -3 million points. Harry said indignantly to the empty hallway. That seems excessive. I want to file an appeal with the game authorities. And how am I supposed to make up 3 million points in the next 2 turns? Another note flew over his head. Appeal, failed. Asking the wrong questions. -1 trillion points. Current points, -1,2,999,871. Turns remaining, 1. Harry gave up. With 1 turn remaining, all he could do was take his best shot, even if it wasn't very good. My guess is that the game represents life. A final sheet of paper flew over his head, reading. Attempt failed. Failed, failed, failed. Aye. Current points, -infinity. You have lost the game. Final instruction. Go to Professor McGonagall's office. The last line was in his own handwriting. Harry stared at the last line for a while, then shrugged.
Fine.
Professor McGonagall's office it would be. If she was the game controller. Okay, honestly, Harry had absolutely no idea how he would feel if Professor McGonagall was the game controller. His mind was just drawing a complete blank. It was literally unimaginable. A couple of portraits later, it wasn't a long trip. Professor McGonagall's office wasn't far from her Transfiguration classroom, at least not on Mondays on odd-numbered years. Harry stood outside the door to her office. He knocked. Come in, said Professor McGonagall's muffled voice. He entered. 14. The unknown and the unknowable. Come in, said Professor McGonagall's muffled voice. Harry did so. The office of the deputy headmistress was clean and well organized. On the wall immediately adjacent to the desk was a maze of wooden cubbyholes of all shapes and sizes, most with several parchment scrolls thrust into them, and it was somehow very clear that Professor McGonagall knew exactly what every cubbyhole meant, even if no one else did. A single parchment lay on the actual desk, which was, aside from that, clean. Behind the desk was a closed door barred with several locks. Professor McGonagall was sitting on a backless stool behind the desk, looking puzzled. Her eyes had widened, with perhaps a slight note of apprehension, as she saw Harry. "Mr. Potter," said Professor McGonagall, "what is this about?" Harry's mind went blank. He'd been instructed by the game to come here. He had been expecting her to have something in mind. "Mr. Potter," said Professor McGonagall, starting to look slightly annoyed. Thankfully, Harry's panicking brain remembered at this point that he did have something he'd been planning to discuss with Professor McGonagall. Something important and well worth her time.
Harry said.
"If there are any spells you can cast to make sure no one's listening to us." Professor McGonagall stood up from her chair, firmly closed the outer door, and began taking out her wand and saying spells. It was at this point that Harry realized he was faced with a priceless and possibly irreplaceable opportunity to offer Professor McGonagall a ComEd tea, and he couldn't believe he was seriously thinking that, and it would be fine. The soda would vanish after a few seconds, and he told that part of himself to shut up. It did, and Harry began to organize mentally what he was going to say. He hadn't planned to have this discussion quite so soon, but so long as he was here. Professor McGonagall finished a spell that sounded a lot older than Latin, and then she sat down again. "All right," she said in a quiet voice. "No one's listening." Her face was rather tight. "Oh, right. She's expecting me to blackmail her for information about the prophecy." Harry'd get around to that some other day. "It's about the incident with the Sorting Hat," Harry said. Professor McGonagall blinked. I think there's an extra spell on the Sorting Hat. Something that the Sorting Hat itself doesn't know about. Something that triggers when the Sorting Hat says Slytherin. I heard a message that I'm pretty sure Ravenclaws aren't supposed to hear. It came the moment the Sorting Hat was off my head, and I felt the connection break. It sounded like a hiss and like English at the same time. There was a sharp intake of breath from McGonagall, and it said, "Salutations from Slytherin to Slytherin. If you would seek my secrets, speak to my snake." Professor McGonagall sat there with her mouth open, staring at Harry as if he'd grown another 2 heads. "So," Professor McGonagall said slowly, as though she couldn't believe the words that were coming out of her own lips, "you decided to come to me right away and tell me about it." "Well, yes, of course," Harry said. There was no need to admit how long it had taken him to actually think of that. As opposed to, say, trying to research it myself or telling any of the other children. "I see," Professor McGonagall said. "And if, perhaps, you were to discover the entrance to Salazar Slytherin's legendary Chamber of Secrets, an entrance that you and you alone could open, I would close the entrance and report to you at once so that a team of experienced magical archaeologists could be assembled," Harry said promptly. "Then I would open up the entrance again, and they would go in very carefully to make sure that there was nothing dangerous. I might go in later to look around, or if they needed me to open up something else, but it would be after the area had been declared clear and they had photographs of how everything looked before people started tromping around their priceless historical site." Professor McGonagall sat there with her mouth open, staring at him like he'd just turned into a cat. "It's obvious if you're not a Gryffindor," Harry said kindly. "I think," Professor McGonagall said in a rather choked voice, "that you far underestimate the rarity of common sense, Mr. Potter."
That sounded about right.
Although a Hufflepuff would have said the same thing. McGonagall paused, struck. "That's true. Sorting Hat offered me Hufflepuff." She blinked at him as though she couldn't believe her own ears. "Did it really?"
"Yes."
"Mr. Potter," McGonagall said, and now her voice was low. 5 decades ago was the last time a student died within the walls of Hogwarts, and I am now certain that 5 decades ago was the last time someone heard that message." A chill went through Harry. "Then I will be very sure to take no action whatsoever on this matter without consulting you, Professor McGonagall." He paused. "And may I suggest that you get together the best people you can find and see if it's possible to get that extra spell off the Sorting Hat, And if you can't do that, maybe put on another spell, a quietus that briefly activates just as the hat is being removed from a student's head. That might work as a patch. There, no more dead students. Harry nodded in satisfaction. Professor McGonagall looked even more stunned, if such a thing were imaginable. I cannot possibly award you enough points for this without giving the House Cup to Ravenclaw outright.
Harry said.
I'd rather not earn that many house points. Now Professor McGonagall was giving him a strange look. Why not? Harry was having a little difficulty putting it into words. Because it would be just too sad, you know? Like back when I was still trying to go to school in the Muggle world, and whenever there was a group project, I'd go ahead and do the whole thing myself because the others would only slow me down. I'm fine with earning lots of points, more than anyone else even. But if I earn enough to be decisive in winning the House Cup just by myself, then it's like I'm carrying House Ravenclaw on my back, and that's too sad. I see, McGonagall said hesitantly. It was apparent that this way of thinking had never occurred to her. Suppose I only awarded you 50 points, then? Harry shook his head again. It's not fair to the other children if I earn lots of points for grown-up things that I can be part of, and they can't. How is Terry Boot supposed to earn 50 points for reporting a whisper he heard from the Sorting Hat? It wouldn't be fair at all. I see why the Sorting Hat offered you Hufflepuff, said Professor McGonagall. She was eyeing him with a strange respect. That made Harry choke up a bit. He'd honestly thought he wasn't worthy of Hufflepuff. That the Sorting Hat had just been trying to shove him anywhere but Ravenclaw, into a house whose virtues he didn't have. Professor McGonagall was smiling now. And if I try to give you 10 points, are you going to explain where those 10 points came from if anyone asks? There might be a lot of Slytherins, and I don't mean the children at Hogwarts, who would be really, really angry if they knew about the spell being taken off the Sorting Hat and found out I was involved. So I think that absolute secrecy is the better part of valor. No need to thank me, ma'am. Virtue is its own reward. So it is, Professor McGonagall said, but I do have a very special something else to give you. I see that I have greatly wronged you in my thoughts, Mr. Potter. Please wait here. She got up, went over to the locked back door, waved her wand, and a sort of blurry curtain sprang up around her. Harry could neither see nor hear what was going on. It was a few minutes later that the blur vanished and Professor McGonagall was standing there, facing him, with the door behind her looking as though it hadn't ever been opened. And Professor McGonagall held out in one hand a necklace, a thin golden chain bearing in its center a silver circle, within which was the device of an hourglass. In her other hand was a folded pamphlet.
This is for you, she said. Wow.
He was going to get some sort of neat magical item as a quest reward. Apparently that business with refusing offers of monetary rewards until you got a magic item actually worked in real life, not just computer games. Harry accepted his new necklace, smiling. What is it? Professor McGonagall took a breath. Mr. Potter, this is an item which is ordinarily lent only to children who have already shown themselves to be highly responsible, in order to help them with difficult class schedules. McGonagall hesitated, as though about to add something else. I must emphasize, Mr. Potter, that this item's true nature is secret, and that you must not tell any of the other students about it, or let them see you using it. If that's not acceptable to you, then you can give it back now. I can keep secrets, Harry said. So what does it do? So far as the other students are concerned, this is a spinster wicket, and it is used to treat a rare, non-contagious magical ailment called spontaneous duplication. You wear it under your clothes, and while you have no reason to show it to anyone, you also have no reason to treat it as an awful secret. Spinster wickets are not interesting. Do you understand, Mr. Potters? Harry nodded, his smile widening. He sensed the work of a competent Slytherin. And what does it really do? It's a time turner. Each spin of the hourglass sends you 1 hour back in time. So if you use it to go back 2 hours every day, you should always be able to get to sleep at the same time. Harry's suspension of disbelief blew completely out the window. You're giving me a time machine to treat my sleep disorder. You're giving me a time machine to treat my sleep disorder. You're giving me a time machine in order to treat my sleep disorder. Ehehehe. Harry's mouth said. He was now holding the necklace away from him as though it were a live bomb. Well, no, not as if it were a live bomb. That didn't begin to describe the severity of the situation. Harry held the necklace away from him as though it were a time machine. Say, Professor McGonagall, did you know that time-reversed ordinary matter looks just like antimatter? Why, yes it does. Did you know that 1 kilogram of antimatter encountering 1 kilogram of matter will annihilate in an explosion equivalent to 43 million tons of TNT? Do you realize that I myself weigh 41 kilograms and that the resulting blast would leave a giant smoking crater where there used to be Scotland? Excuse me, Harry managed to say, but this sounds really, 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 really dangerous. Harry's voice didn't quite rise to a shriek. He couldn't possibly scream loud enough to do this situation justice, so there was no point in trying. Professor McGonagall looked upon him with tolerant affection. I'm glad you're taking this seriously, Mr. Potter, but time turners aren't that dangerous. We wouldn't give them to children if they were. Really? Harry said. Ahahaha. Of course you wouldn't give time machines to children if they were dangerous. What was I thinking? So, just to be clear, sneezing on this device will not send me into the Middle Ages where I will run over Gutenberg with a horse cart and prevent the Enlightenment? Because, I hate it when that happens to me. McGonagall's lips were twitching in that way she had when she was trying not to smile. She offered Harry the pamphlet she was holding, but Harry was carefully holding out the necklace with both hands and staring at the hourglass to make sure it wasn't about to turn. Don't worry, McGonagall said after a momentary pause, when it became clear that Harry wasn't going to move. That can't possibly happen, Mr. Potter. The time turner cannot be used to move more than 6 hours backwards. It can't be used more than 6 times in any day. Oh, good, very good, that. And if someone bumps into me, the time turner will not break and will not trap the whole castle of Hogwarts in an endlessly repeating loop of Thursdays. Well, they can be fragile, said McGonagall. And I do think I've heard about strange things happening if they're broken. But nothing like that. Perhaps, Harry said when he could speak again, you ought to provide your time machines with some sort of protective shell, rather than leaving the glass exposed, so as to prevent that from happening. McGonagall looked quite struck. That's an excellent idea, Mr. Potter. I shall inform the Ministry of it. That's it. It's official now. They've ratified it in Parliament. Everyone in the wizarding world is completely stupid. And while I hate to get all philosophical, Harry desperately tried to lower his voice to something under a shriek. Has anyone thought about the implications of going back 6 hours and doing something that changes time, which would pretty much delete all the people affected and replace them with different versions dash? Oh, you can't change time. Professor McGonagall interrupted. Good heavens, Mr. Potter, do you think these would be allowed students if that was possible? What if someone tried to change their test scores? Harry took a moment to process this. His hands relaxed, just a little, from their white grip on the hourglass chain. Like, he wasn't holding a time machine, just a live nuclear warhead. So, Harry said slowly, people just find that the universe happens to be self-consistent, somehow, even though it has time travel in it. If I and my future self interact, then I'll see the same thing as both of me, even though on my own first run-through, my future self is already acting in full knowledge of things that, from my own perspective, haven't happened yet. Harry's voice trailed off into the inadequacy of English. Correct, I think, said Professor McGonagall. Although wizards are advised to avoid being seen by their past selves. If you're attending 2 classes at the same time and you need to cross paths with yourself, for example, the first version of you should step aside and close his eyes at a known time. You have a watch already, good, so that the future you can pass. It's all there in the pamphlet. Ahahaha. And what happens when someone ignores that advice? Professor McGonagall pursed her lips. I understand that it can be quite disconcerting, and it doesn't, say, create a paradox that destroys the universe. She smiled tolerantly. Mr. Potter, I think I'd remember hearing if that had ever happened. That is not reassuring. Haven't you people ever heard of the anthropic principle? And what idiot ever built one of these things for the first time? Professor McGonagall actually laughed. It was a pleasant, glad sound that seemed surprisingly out of place on that stern face. You're having another you turned into a cat moment, aren't you, Mr. Potter? You probably don't want to hear this, but it's quite endearingly cute. Turning into a cat doesn't even begin to compare to this. You know, right up until this moment, I had this awful suppressed thought somewhere in the back of my mind that the only remaining answer was that my whole universe was a computer simulation like in the book Simulacrum 3, but now even that is ruled out because this little toy isn't Turing computable. A Turing machine could simulate going back into a defined moment of the past and computing a different future from there. An Oracle machine could rely on the halting behavior of lower-order machines, but what you're saying is that reality somehow self-consistently computes in one sweep using information that hasn't happened yet. Realization struck Harry a pile-driver blow. It all made sense now. It all finally made sense. So that's how the ComEd T works. Of course. The spell doesn't force funny events to happen. It just makes you feel an impulse to drink right before funny things are going to happen anyway. I'm such a fool. I should have realized when I felt the impulse to drink the ComEd tea before Dumbledore's second speech. Didn't drink it, and then choked on my own saliva instead. Drinking the ComEd, it doesn't cause the comedy. The comedy causes you to drink the ComEd. I saw the two events were correlated and assumed the ComEd tea had to be the cause and the comedy had to be the effect because I thought temporal order restrained causation and causal graphs had to be acyclic, but it all makes sense once you draw the causal arrows going backwards in time. Realization struck Harry the second pile driver. This one he managed to keep quiet, making only a small strangling sound like a dying kitten as he realized who'd put the note on his bed this morning. Professor McGonagall's eyes were alight. After you graduate, or possibly even before, you really must teach some of these Muggle theories at Hogwarts, Mr. Potter. They sound quite fascinating, even if they're all wrong. Gleha. Professor McGonagall offered him a few more pleasantries, demanded a few more promises to which Harry nodded, said something about not talking to snakes where anyone could hear him, reminded him to read the pamphlet, and then somehow Harry found himself standing outside her office with the door closed firmly behind him. Gehrara, Harry said. Why, yes, his mind was blown. Not least by the fact that, if not for the prank, he might well have never obtained a time turner in the first place. Or would Professor McGonagall have given it to him anyway, only later in the day, whenever he got around to asking about his sleep disorder or telling her about the Sorting Hat's message? And would he, at that time, have wanted to pull a prank on himself which would have led to him getting the time turner earlier? So that the only self-consistent possibility was the one in which the prank started before he even woke up in the morning? Harry found himself considering, for the first time in his life, that the answer to his question might be literally inconceivable. That since his own brain contained neurons that only ran forwards in time, there was nothing his brain could do, no operation it could perform, which was conjugate to the operation of a time turner. Up until this point, Harry had lived by the admonition of E.T. Janes that if you were ignorant about a phenomenon, that was a fact about your own state of mind, not a fact about the phenomenon itself, that your uncertainty was a fact about you, not a fact about whatever you were uncertain about, that ignorance existed in the mind, not in reality, that a blank map did not correspond to a blank territory. There were mysterious questions, but a mysterious answer was a contradiction in terms. A phenomenon could be mysterious to some particular person, but there could be no phenomena mysterious of themselves. To worship a sacred mystery was just to worship your own ignorance. So Harry had looked upon magic and refused to be intimidated. People had no sense of history, they learned about chemistry and biology and astronomy and thought that these matters had always been the proper meat of science, that they had never been mysterious. The stars had once been mysteries. Lord Kelvin had once called the nature of life and biology, the response of muscles to human will, and the generation of trees from seeds, a mystery infinitely beyond the reach of science. Not just a little beyond, mind you, but infinitely beyond. Lord Kelvin certainly had felt a huge emotional charge from not knowing something. Every mystery ever solved had been a puzzle from the dawn of the human species right up until someone solved it. Now, for the first time, he was up against the prospect of a mystery that was threatening to be permanent. If time didn't work by acyclic causal networks, then Harry didn't understand what was meant by cause and effect. And if Harry didn't understand causes and effects, then he didn't understand what sort of stuff reality might be made of instead. and it was entirely possible that his human mind never could understand, because his brain was made of old-fashioned linear time neurons, and this had turned out to be an impoverished subset of reality. On the plus side, the Comed T, which had once seemed all-powerful and all-unbelievable, had turned out to have a much simpler explanation, which he'd missed merely because the truth was completely outside his hypothesis space or anything that his brain had evolved to comprehend. But now he actually had figured it, probably, which was sort of encouraging. Sort of. Harry glanced down at his watch. It was nearly 11 a.m. He'd gotten to sleep last night at 1 a.m., so in the natural state of affairs he'd go to sleep tonight at 3 a.m. So to go to sleep at 10 p.m. and wake up at 7 a.m., he should go back 5 hours total, which meant that if he wanted to get back to his dorm at around 6 a.m. before anyone was awake, he'd better hurry up. And even in retrospect, Harry didn't understand how he'd pulled off half the stuff involved in the prank. Where had the pie come from? Harry was starting to seriously fear time travel. On the other hand, he had to admit that it had been an irreplaceable opportunity. A prank you could only pull on yourself once in a lifetime, within 6 hours of when you first found out about time turners. In fact, that was even more puzzling when Harry thought about it. Time had presented him with the finished prank as a fait accompli, and yet it was, quite clearly, his own handiwork. Concept and execution and writing style. Every last part, even the ones he still didn't understand. Well, time was wasting, and there were at most 30 hours in a day. Harry did know some of what he had to do, and he might figure out the rest, like the pie, while he was working. There was no point putting it off. He couldn't exactly accomplish anything stuck here in the future. 5 hours earlier, Harry was sneaking into his dorm with his robes pulled up over his head as a thin sort of disguise, just in case someone was already up and about and saw him at the same time as Harry lying in his bed. He didn't want to have to explain to anyone about his little medical problem with spontaneous duplication. Fortunately, it seemed that everyone was still asleep. And there also seemed to be a box, wrapped in red and green paper with a bright golden ribbon, lying next to his bed. The perfect, stereotypical image of a Christmas present, although it wasn't Christmas. Harry crept in as softly as he could manage, just in case someone had their quieter turned down low. There was an envelope attached to the box, closed by plain clear wax without a seal impressed. Harry carefully pried the envelope open and took out the letter inside. The letter said, "This is the cloak of invisibility of Ignotus Peverell, passed down through his descendants the Potters. Unlike lesser cloaks and spells, it has the power to keep you hidden, not merely invisible. Your father lent it to me to study shortly before he died, and I confess that I have received much good use of it over the years. In the future, I shall have to get along with disillusionment, I fear. It is time the cloak was returned to you, its heir. I had thought to make this a Christmas present, but it wished to come back to your hand before then. It seems to expect you to have need of it. Use it well. No doubt you are already thinking of all manner of wonderful pranks, as your father committed in his day. If his full misdeeds were known, every woman in Gryffindor would gather to desecrate his grave. I shall not try to stop history from repeating, but be most careful not to reveal yourself. If Dumbledore saw a chance to possess one of the Deathly Hallows, he would never let it escape his grasp until the day he died. A very Merry Christmas to you." The note was unsigned. "Hold on," Harry said, pulling up short as the other boys were about to leave the Ravenclaw dorm. "Sorry, there's something else I've got to do with my trunk. I'll be along to breakfast in a couple of minutes." Terry Boots scowled at Harry. "You'd better not be planning to go through any of our things." Harry held up one hand. "I swear that I intend to do nothing of the sort to any of your things, that I only intend to access objects that I myself own, that I have no pranking or otherwise questionable intentions towards any of you, and that I do not anticipate those intentions changing before I get to breakfast in the Great Hall." Terry frowned. "Wait, is that Dash?" "Don't worry," said Penelope Clearwater, who was there to guide them. There were no loopholes. "Well worded, Potter. You should be a lawyer." Harry Potter blinked at that. Yes, Ravenclaw prefect."
"Thank you," he said.
"I think, when you try to find the Great Hall, you will get lost." Penelope stated this in the tones of a flat, unarguable fact. "As soon as you do, Ask a portrait how to get to the first floor. Ask another portrait the instant you suspect you might be lost again, especially if it seems like you're going up higher and higher. If you are higher than the whole castle ought to be, stop and wait for search parties. Otherwise, we shall see you again 4 months later, and you will be 5 months older and dressed in a loincloth and covered in snow, and that's if you stay inside the castle. Understood, said Harry, swallowing hard. Shouldn't you tell students all that sort of stuff right away? Penelope sighed. What? All of it? That would take weeks. You'll pick it up as you go along. She turned to go, followed by the other students. If I don't see you at breakfast in 30 minutes, Potter, I'll start the search. Once everyone was gone, Harry attached the note to his bed. He'd already written it and all the other notes, working in his cavern level before everyone else woke up. Then he carefully reached inside the quietus field and pulled the cloak of invisibility off Harry One's still sleeping form. And just for the sake of mischief, Harry put the cloak into Harry One's pouch, knowing it would thereby already be in his own. I can see that the message is passed on to Cornelian Flubberwalt, said the painting of a man with aristocratic airs and, in fact, a perfectly normal nose. But might I ask where it came from originally? Harry shrugged, with artful helplessness. I was told that it was spoken by a hollow voice that belled forth from a gap within the air itself, a gap that opened upon a fiery abyss. Hey, Hermione said in tones of indignation from her place on the other side of the breakfast table. That's everyone's dessert. You can't just take one whole pie and put it in your pouch. I'm not taking one pie, I'm taking 2. Sorry everyone. Gotta run now. Harry ignored the cries of outrage and left the Great Hall. He needed to arrive at herbology class a little early. Professor Sprout eyed him sharply. And how do you know what the Slytherins are planning? I can't name my source, Harry said. In fact, I have to ask you to pretend that this conversation never happened. Just act like you happened across them naturally while you were on an errand or something. I'll run on ahead as soon as herbology gets out. I think I can distract the Slytherins until you get there. I'm not easy to scare or bully, and I don't think they'll dare to seriously hurt the boy who lived. Though, I'm not asking you to run in the hallways, but I would appreciate it if you didn't dawdle along the way. Professor Sprout looked at him for a long moment, then her expression softened. Please be careful with yourself, Harry Potter. And thank you. Just be sure not to be late, Harry said. And remember, when you get there, you weren't expecting to see me, and this conversation never happened. It was horrible, watching himself yank Neville out of the circle of Slytherins. Neville had been right. He'd used too much force, way too much force. Hello, Harry Potter said coldly. I'm the boy who lived. 8 first-year boys, mostly the same height. One of them had a scar on his forehead, and he wasn't acting like the others. A wadsome power the gifty gies. To see our souls as others see us. A wad fray money a blunder free us. And foolish notion. Professor McGonagall was right. The Sorting Hat was right. It was clear once you saw it from the outside. There was something wrong with Harry Potter. 15. Conscientiousness. Frigidaire. Harry dipped a finger in the glass of water on his desk. It should have been cool. But lukewarm it was, and lukewarm it had stayed. Again. Harry was feeling very, very cheated. There were hundreds of fantasy novels scattered around the Verres household. Harry had read quite a few, and it was starting to look like he had a mysterious dark side. So after the glass of water had refused to cooperate the first few times, Harry had glanced around the charms classroom to make sure no one was watching, and then taken a deep breath, concentrated, and made himself angry. Thought about the Slytherins bullying Neville, and the game where someone knocked down your books every time you tried to pick them up again. Thought about what Draco Malfoy had said about the 10-year-old Lovegood girl and how the Wisengamot really operated, and the fury had entered his blood. He had held out his wand in a hand that trembled with hate and said in cold tones, Frigidaire, and absolutely nothing had happened. Harry had been gypped. He wanted to write someone and demand a refund on his dark side, which clearly ought to have irresistible magical power, but had turned out to be defective. Frigidaire, said Hermione again from the desk next to him. Her water was solid ice, and there were white crystals forming on the rim of her glass. She seemed to be totally intent on her own work and not at all conscious of the other students staring at her with hateful eyes, which was either A, dangerously oblivious of her, or B, a perfectly honed performance rising to the level of fine art. "Oh, very good, Miss Granger," squeaked Phileas Flitwick, their charms professor and head of Ravenclaw, a tiny little man with no visible signs of being a past dueling champion. "Excellent. Stupendous." Harry had expected to be, in the worst case, second behind Hermione. Harry would have preferred for her to be rivaling him, of course, but he could have accepted it the other way around. As of Monday, Harry was headed for the bottom of the class, a position for which he was companionably rivaling all the other Muggle-raised students except Hermione, who was all alone and rivalless at the top. Poor thing. Professor Flitwick was standing over the desk of one of the other Muggle-borns and quietly adjusting the way she was holding her wand. Harry looked over at Hermione. He swallowed hard. It was the obvious role for her, in the scheme of things. "Hermione," Harry said tentatively, "do you have any idea what I might be doing wrong?" Hermione's eyes lit up with a terrible light of helpfulness, and something in the back of Harry's brain screamed in desperate humiliation. 5 minutes later, Harry's water did seem noticeably cooler than room temperature, and Hermione had given him a few verbal pats on the head and told him to pronounce it more carefully next time, and gone off to help someone else. Professor Flitwick had given her a house point for helping him. Harry was gritting his teeth so hard his jaw ached, and that wasn't helping his pronunciation. "I don't care if it's unfair competition. I know exactly what I am doing with 2 extra hours every day. I am going to sit in my trunk and study until I am keeping up with Hermione Granger. Transfiguration is some of the most complex and dangerous magic you will learn at Hogwarts," said Professor McGonagall. There was no trace of any levity upon the face of the stern old witch. "Anyone messing around in my class will leave and not come back. You have been warned." Her wand came down and tapped her desk, which smoothly reshaped itself into a pig. A couple of Muggle-born students gave out small yelps. The pig looked around and snorted, seeming confused, and then became a desk again. The Transfiguration professor looked around the classroom, and then her eyes settled on one student. "Mr. Potter," said Professor McGonagall, "you only received your schoolbooks a few days ago. Have you started reading your Transfiguration textbook?" "No, sorry, Professor," Harry said. "You needn't apologize, Mr. Potter. If you were required to read ahead, you would have been told to do so." McGonagall's fingers wrapped the desk in front of her. "Mr. Potter, would you care to guess whether this is a desk which I transfigured into a pig, or if it began as a pig and I briefly removed the transfiguration? If you had read the first chapter of your textbook, you would know." Harry's eyebrows furrowed slightly. "I'd guess it'd be easier to start with a pig, since if it started as a desk, it might not know how to stand up." Professor McGonagall shook her head. "No fault to you, Mr. Potter, but the correct answer is that in Transfiguration you do not care to guess. Wrong answers will be marked with extreme severity. Questions left blank will be marked with great leniency. You must learn to know what you do not know. If I ask you any question, no matter how obvious or elementary, and you answer, 'I'm not sure,' I will not hold it against you, and anyone who laughs will lose house points. Can you tell me why this rule exists, Mr. Potters? Because a single error in Transfiguration can be incredibly dangerous." "No."
Correct.
Transfiguration is more dangerous than apparition, which is not taught until your 6th year. Unfortunately, Transfiguration must be learned and practiced at a young age to maximize your adult ability. So this is a dangerous subject, and you should be quite scared of making any mistakes, because none of my students have ever been permanently injured, and I will be extremely put out if you are the first class to spoil my record." Several students gulped. Professor McGonagall stood up and moved over to the wall behind her desk, which held a polished wooden board. "There are many reasons why Transfiguration is dangerous, but one reason stands above all the rest." She produced a short quill with a thick end, and used it to sketch letters in red, which she then underlined, using the same marker in blue. "Transfiguration is not permanent." "Transfiguration is not permanent," said Professor McGonagall. "Transfiguration is not permanent. Transfiguration is not permanent." Mr. Potter, suppose a student transfigured a block of wood into a cup of water, and you drank it. What do you imagine might happen to you when the transfiguration wore off? There was a pause. Excuse me, I should not have asked that of you, Mr. Potter. I forgot that you are blessed with an unusually pessimistic imagination. I'm fine, Harry said, swallowing hard. So the first answer is that I don't know. The professor nodded approvingly, but I imagine there might be wood in my stomach and in my bloodstream, and if any of that water had gotten absorbed into my body's tissues, would it be wood pulp or solid wood or... Harry's grasp of magic failed him. He couldn't understand how wood mapped into water in the first place, so he couldn't understand what would happen after the water molecules were scrambled by ordinary thermal motions and the magic wore off and the mapping reversed. McGonagall's face was stiff. As Mr. Potter has correctly reasoned, he would become extremely sick and require immediate flying to St. Mungo's Hospital if he was to have any chance of survival. Please turn your textbooks to page 5. Even without any sound in the moving picture, you could tell that the woman with horribly discolored skin was screaming. The criminal who originally transfigured gold into wine and gave it to this woman to drink, in payment of the debt, as he put it, received a sentence of 10 years in Azkaban. Please turn to page 6. That is a Dementor. They are the guardians of Azkaban. They suck away at your magic, your life, and any happy thoughts you try to have. The picture on page 7 is of the criminal 10 years later, on his release. You will note that he is dead, yes, Mr. Potter? Professor, Harry said, if the worst happens in a case like that, is there any way of maintaining the transfiguration? No, Professor McGonagall said flatly. Sustaining a transfiguration is a constant drain on your magic, which scales with the size of the target form. And you would need to recontact the target every few hours, which is, in a case like this, impossible. Disasters like this are unrecoverable. Professor McGonagall leaned forwards, her face very hard. You will absolutely never, under any circumstances, transfigure anything into a liquid or a gas. No water, no air. Nothing like water, nothing like air. Even if it is not meant to drink. Liquid evaporates, little bits and pieces of it get into the air. You will not transfigure anything that is to be burned. It will make smoke, and someone could breathe that smoke. You will never transfigure anything that could conceivably go inside anyone's body, by any means. No food. Nothing that looks like food. Not even as a funny little prank where you mean to tell them about your mud pie before they actually eat it. You will never do it. Period. Inside this classroom, or out of it, or anywhere. Is that well understood by every single student? Yes, said Harry, Hermione, and a few others. The rest seemed to be speechless. Is that well understood by every single student? Yes, they said or muttered or whispered. If you break any of these rules, you will not further study Transfiguration during your stay at Hogwarts. Repeat along with me. I will never transfigure anything into a liquid or gas. I will never transfigure anything into a liquid or gas, said the students in ragged chorus. Again. Louder. I will never transfigure anything into a liquid or gas. I will never transfigure anything into a liquid or gas. I will never transfigure anything that looks like food or anything else that goes inside a human body. I will never transfigure anything that is to be burned, because it could make smoke. You will never transfigure anything that looks like money, including Muggle money, said Professor McGonagall. The goblins have ways of finding out who did it. As a matter of recognized law, the Goblin Nation is in a permanent state of war with all magical counterfeiters. They will not send Ors. They will send an army. I will never transfigure anything that looks like money, repeated the students. And above all, said Professor McGonagall, you will not transfigure any living subject, especially yourselves. It will make you very sick and possibly dead, depending on how you transfigure yourself and how long you maintain the change. Professor McGonagall paused. Mr. Potter is currently holding up his hand because he has seen an animagus transformation, specifically a human transforming into a cat and back again. But an animagus transformation is not free transfiguration. Professor McGonagall took a small chunk of wood out of her pocket. With a tap of her wand it became a glass ball. Then she said Christfarium, and the glass ball became a steel ball. She tapped it with her wand one last time, and the steel ball became a piece of wood once more. Christvarium transforms a subject of solid glass into a similarly shaped target of solid steel. It cannot do the reverse, nor can it transform a desk into a pig. The most general form of transfiguration, free transfiguration, which you will be learning here, is capable of transforming any subject into any target, at least so far as physical form is concerned. For this reason, free transfiguration must be done wordlessly. Using charms would require different words for every different transformation between subject and target. Professor McGonagall gave her students a sharp look. Some teachers begin with transfiguration charms and move on to free transfiguration afterwards. Yes, that would be much easier in the beginning, but it can set you in a poor mold which impairs your abilities later. Here you will learn free transfiguration from the very start, which requires that you cast the spell wordlessly by holding the subject form, the target form, and the transformation within your own mind. And to answer Mr. Potter's question, Professor McGonagall went on, it is free transfiguration which you must never do to any living subject. There are charms and potions which can safely, reversibly transform living subjects in limited ways. An animagus with a missing limb will still be missing that limb after transforming, for example. Free transfiguration is not safe. Your body will change while it is transfigured. Breathing, for example, results in a constant loss of the body's stuff to the surrounding air. When the transfiguration wears off and your body tries to revert to its original form, it will not quite be able to do so. If you press your wand to your body and imagine yourself with golden hair, afterwards your hair will fall out. If you visualize yourself as someone with clearer skin, you'll be taking a long stay at St. Mungo's. And if you transfigure yourself into an adult bodily form, then, when the transfiguration wears off, you will die. That explained why he had seen such things as fat boys, or girls less than perfectly pretty, or old people for that matter. That wouldn't happen if you could just transfigure yourself every morning. Harry raised his hand and tried to signal Professor McGonagall with his eyes. Yes, Mr. Potter? Is it possible to transfigure a living subject into a target that is static, such as a coin? No, excuse me, I'm terribly sorry, let's just say a steel ball. Professor McGonagall shook her head. Mr. Potter, even inanimate objects undergo small internal changes over time. There would be no visible changes to your body afterwards, and for the first minute, you would notice nothing wrong. But in an hour you would be sick, and in a day you would be dead. Excuse me. So, if I'd read the first chapter, one could have guessed that the desk was originally a desk and not a pig, Harry said, but only if I made the further assumption that you didn't want to kill the pig. That might seem highly probable, but I can foresee that marking your tests will be an endless source of delight to me, Mr. Potter. But if you have other questions, can I please ask you to wait until after class? No further questions, Professor. Now repeat after me, said Professor McGonagall. I will never try to transfigure any living subject, especially myself, unless specifically instructed to do so using a specialized charm or potion. If I am not sure whether a transfiguration is safe, I will not try it until I have asked Professor McGonagall or Professor Flitwick or Professor Snape or the headmaster, who are the only recognized authorities on transfiguration at Hogwarts. Asking another student is not acceptable, even if they say that they remember asking the same question. Even if the current defense professor at Hogwarts tells me that a transfiguration is safe, and even if I see the defense professor do it and nothing bad seems to happen, I will not try it myself. I have the absolute right to refuse to perform any transfiguration about which I feel the slightest bit nervous. Since not even the headmaster of Hogwarts can order me to do otherwise, I certainly will not accept any such order from the defense professor, even if the defense professor threatens to deduct 100 house points and have me expelled. If I break any of these rules, I will not further study transfiguration during my time at Hogwarts. We will repeat these rules at the start of every class for the first month, said Professor McGonagall. And now we will begin with matches as subjects and needles as targets. Put away your wands. Thank you. By begin, I meant that you will begin taking notes. Half an hour before the end of class, Professor McGonagall handed out the matches. At the end of the class, Hermione had a silvery-looking match, and the entire rest of the class, Muggle-born or otherwise, had exactly what they'd started with. Professor McGonagall awarded her another point for Ravenclaw. After the Transfiguration class was dismissed, Hermione came over to Harry's desk as Harry was putting away his books into his pouch. "You know," Hermione said with an innocent expression on her face, "I earned 2 points for Ravenclaw today." "So you did," Harry said shortly. "But that wasn't as good as your 7 points," she said. "I guess I'm just not as intelligent as you." Harry finished feeding his homework into the pouch and turned to Hermione, with his eyes narrowed.
He'd actually forgotten about that.
She batted her eyelashes at him. "We have lessons every day, though. I wonder how long it will take you to find some more Hufflepuffs to rescue. Today is Monday, so that gives you until Thursday." The two of them stared into each other's eyes, unblinking. Harry spoke first. "Of course you realize this means war. I didn't know we'd been at peace." All of the other students were now watching with fascinated eyes. All of the other students, plus, unfortunately, Professor McGonagall. "Oh, Mr. Potter," sang Professor McGonagall from the other side of the room, "I have some good news for you. Madame Pomfrey has approved your suggestion for preventing breakage in her spinster wickets, and the plan is to finish the job by the end of next week. I'd say that deserves, let's call it 10 points for Ravenclaw." Hermione's face was gaping in betrayal and shock. Harry imagined his own face didn't look much different. "Professor," Harry hissed, "those 10 points are unquestionably deserved, Mr. Potter. I would not hand out house points on a whim. To you it might have been a simple matter of seeing something fragile and suggesting a way to protect it, but spinster wickets are expensive, and the headmaster was not pleased the last time one broke." Professor McGonagall looked thoughtful. "I wonder if any other student has ever earned 17 house points on his first day of lessons. I'll have to look it up, but I suspect that's a new record. Perhaps we should have an announcement at dinner time." "Professor," Harry shrieked, "this is our war. Stop meddling. Now you have until Thursday of next week, Mr. Potter. Unless, of course, you engage in some sort of mischief and lose house points before then. Addressing a professor disrespectfully, for example." Professor McGonagall put a finger on her cheek and looked reflective. "I expect you'll hit negative numbers before the end of Friday." Harry's mouth snapped shut. He sent his best death glare at McGonagall, but she only seemed to find it amusing. "Yes, definitely an announcement at dinner," Professor McGonagall mused. "But it wouldn't do to offend the Slytherins, so the announcement should be brief. Just the number of points and the fact of the record, and if anyone comes to you for help with their schoolwork and is disappointed that you haven't even started reading your textbooks, you can always refer them to Miss Granger." "Professor," said Hermione in a rather high-pitched voice. Professor McGonagall ignored her. I wonder how long it will take before Miss Granger does something deserving of a dinner-time announcement. I look forward to seeing it, whatever it may be." Harry and Hermione, by unspoken mutual consent, turned and stormed out of the classroom. They were followed by a trail of hypnotized Ravenclaws. Harry said, "Are we still on for after dinners?" "Of course," said Hermione. "I wouldn't want you to fall further behind on your studying." "Why, thank you. And let me say that as brilliant as you are already, I can't help but wonder what you'll be like once you have some elementary training in rationality. Is it really that useful? It didn't seem to help you with charms or transfiguration." There was a slight pause. "Well, I only got my schoolbooks 4 days ago. That's why I had to earn those 17 house points without using my wand. 4 days ago? Maybe you can't read 8 books in 4 days, but you might have at least read one. How many days will it take to finish at that rate? You know all that mathematics, so can you tell me what's 8 times 4 divided by 0? I've got classes now, which you didn't, but weekends are free, so limit of 8 times 4 divided by epsilon as epsilon approaches 0 plus 10:47 a.m. on Sunday. I did it in 3 days, actually. 2:47 p.m. on Saturday it is, then. I'm sure I'll find the time somewhere." And there was evening and there was morning the first day. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey with Grimoire Audiobooks. We've reached the end of Part 3, Chapters 11 to 15 of Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality by Les Wrong. The twists, insights, and groundbreaking ideas explored in this tale leave us both inspired and eager for more. If you're as intrigued as we are, Let's work together to unlock the next chapter of this extraordinary story. Once this video reaches 50 likes, the next part will be on its way. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you're always updated with the latest magical adventures. Your support is what fuels us to bring these amazing stories to life. Until next time, thank you for being part of the Grimoire Audiobooks family. See you soon for more thought-provoking and magical tales.